Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I just finished listening to called Hanna Arendt, A Life in Dark Times, written by Anne C. Heller. This is a short biography of the famous 20th century intellectual Hannah Arendt, who has had a big impact on the way that Western intellectual culture has processed, especially the horrors of the Holocaust and kind of the rise of totalitarian regimes. So Hannah Arendt's name is one that comes up a lot if you are interested in 20th century history, or if you read journalistic or historical accounts of the not only the events of World War II, but kind of the process that the Western world had to go through, and in many ways is still going through, of trying to process the horrors of what happened in World War II and under Hitler in particular. I picked up this little biography because Hannah Arendt's name is one that I've seen mentioned, all over the place, but I've never had the opportunity or taken the time to read her works. Probably the two most popular works are The Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem, both of which are, again, dealing with that question of how do you process and make sense of Hitler in World War II. And so this little biography is one that has only been out for about a year, came out in 2022, but had very good reviews, and I really enjoyed it. Felt like it did what I was hoping it would do, which is kind of introduce me to Hannah Arendt as a thinker, help me to situate and understand her contributions, and it sets me up well. If I have the time to read some of her works, then I feel like I'm set up well for that. So let me go through a little bit of what Anne Heller covers in the book, and share a little bit about Hannah Arendt. So Heller begins her book actually with the controversy which surrounded Hannah Arendt's originally series of articles, which became the book Eichmann in Jerusalem. So this was around some trials that took place in Israel in the 1960s of Adolf, or is it Adolf? I can't remember his first name. Eichmann is the gentleman. He was a Nazi leader during World War II who was responsible for the death of many, many people. And when you look at kind of what he was responsible for in terms of overseeing the concentration camps and the gas chambers and all of this that marched so many people to their death, you get this picture of this man who must just be some deep moral monster. And one of the things that struck Hannah Arendt, and that struck the world, because this was a very public, televised trial that took place, was that Eichmann didn't seem to fit the profile. He was a kind of small man, with these round glasses, and just looked like a desk clerk. And he basically, his defense was kind of that, well, I was just, one person in a chain, and I was doing paperwork. He wasn't directly killing people, but his decisions and directions were responsible for that. And so Hannah Arendt wrote a series of articles for the New Yorker in the 1960s detailing the trial, which became published as a book, and were very controversial. It amplified the profile of these trials, but also used them to explore the questions of how did this happen? How could someone like Eichmann be a mass murderer in essence? How could a society like Europe, Western Europe, which saw itself as very educated and enlightened and intellectual, how could it commit these atrocities? And one of the things that Hannah Arendt used to describe Eichmann very famously is this phrase, the banality of evil, which actually came, I believe, from her husband, she said later. But that was something that gripped a lot of people's imaginations, this idea that, ordinary people can commit these great crimes. And that's something that I think is hard for people to grapple with. We think of a Hitler, well, he must just be extra evil or extra crazy and, doing these unthinkable things. But Hannah Arendt was arguing that kind of given the right conditions, we can all be prone to that. We could all become a Hitler or an Eichmann in this case. And she actually points the finger in part at the leaders in the Jewish community for not resisting more the things that Hitler and others were doing early on, and that became one of the things that made that work very, very controversial. So Heller begins her biography by kind of diving into that chapter of Hannah Arendt's life, which threw me off a little bit because I was not aware of that controversy. And so I was listening to the first chapter and trying to kind of get my bearings, but it was very well written. It was very engaging. And after kind of walking through that, which is, I've kind of since learned that that's one of the, kind of big flashpoints in her life. Heller then goes back and begins to tell us the story of Hannah Arendt. So it becomes kind of a more conventional biography at that point. And by the end, kind of having read the whole book, I felt like it all fit together well. And so I think that move was fine, but it threw me off a little bit just because I didn't know much about Hannah Arendt's life. But as she jumps back to trace her story, she talks about Arendt's upbringing. She was born in Prussia to a kind of well-to-do, educated, very intellectual Prussian family who was Jewish. Hannah Arendt was not a religious practicing Jew. Later on in her life, she would flirt with Zionism, but she had a very kind of tenuous relationship with both Jewish nationalism and with Jewish religion. I think if Hitler and all of the things that he unleashed had never happened, Hannah Arendt probably would have been one of those people who really downplayed or dismissed her Jewish identity altogether. Of course, that's not a luxury that she had, given the lifetimes that she lived in. But it traces kind of her own development and growth. Very early on, she was marked out as someone who was very intelligent and very gifted, and she also very early on began to receive a lot of attentions from older boys and then men who were also very intellectually oriented. One of the things that has kind of come out about Hannah Arendt since her death is that she had a long-running affair with the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was also famously a Nazi sympathizer at one point. So it becomes this very complex picture of Hannah Arendt, who's this very intellectual, gifted Jewish Prussian author who is pursuing an academic career, an intellectual career. She ends up doing a PhD on Augustine's idea of love. She's very influenced by Heidegger. She studied under him. She's pursuing kind of, the typical academic track. But she falls into this affair with this guy who ends up, in his own way, working to support Hitler's regime. And they have a very strange relationship that kind of spans through her life. And Heller traces that story for us. But Hannah Arendt, is beginning to establish herself as an intellectual right at the time that Hitler is kind of strengthening his grip on Germany. And so she ends up having to flee from Germany, I believe in 1933. She goes originally to Paris and lives there for a time, and then ends up making her way to New York, settling there, and writing, teaching, doing things like that. And she died in the 1970s. So that's kind of the broad sketch of her life. But it was very interesting. She's one of these women that just has this dizzying intellect. She read widely. She thought sharply. She seemed to bump into and befriend just some of the leading lights of the age, again, in Europe and in America. So she has this kind of transatlantic experience and exposure that makes her a really dynamic, interesting character. Obviously intelligent, obviously gifted, but had a very hard life. She was married a few times. She had several affairs. Her husband had several affairs, especially after writing Eichmann in Jerusalem. She had fallings out with both Jewish friends and Gentile friends, and her own identity was something that was always kind of just swirling around in the background. Who is she? What defines her? That kind of thing. And one of the things that Hannah Arendt kind of came to, maybe just because of her life circumstance, was this idea of being a cultural pariah. In other words, someone that is maybe hated by society, maybe looked down on by society, but that person is not bothered by that. And so she kind of developed a very thick skin. And one of the things that she kind of, works out in her own writing and in her own life is, what does it mean to be pushed to the margins? She'd experienced that in Germany, obviously in the context of the Holocaust. She experienced it in Paris in the context of being a refugee, and then she experienced it in America kind of in the context of being sort of an intellectual outsider, someone whose ideas were influential but often controversial. So there were a lot of people who loved to hate her, and she had to work out, well, what is my place in all of this? And so again, reading her biography was very interesting, just to kind of get inside the mind and life of this very gifted woman who would have a big impact on especially mid-20th century intellectual life, and whose legacy continues today. I have not read Hannah Arendt's works, so I say this as someone who's very much a neophyte in all of this. But I think even without reading her works and getting her conclusions, knowing a little bit about her is helpful, because she's grappling with just some big and basic questions. She's grappling with the nature of evil. She's grappling with the question of how do societies get overtaken by authoritarianism and totalitarianism. She deals with questions of what does it mean to be a minority, not thinking just in terms of like racially or ethnically, but to be on the outside, to be on the margin. And who is in that category shifts and changes depending on when you live and where you live, but all kinds of people end up finding themselves in that place. And so in that sense, Hannah Arendt's life and her legacy of thinking and reflection touch on a lot of kind of abiding issues. And so I can see why hers is a name that I've come across. I can see why people continue to find her a stimulating conversation partner. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. So given my own interest and kind of areas of focus, I don't know that I'll have the opportunity or take the time to dive more deeply into her works, but I felt like this book is very valuable because she's one of those people that I had come across enough. I knew that I needed to know more about her, and I think this book, it's about 150 pages, written by Anne C. Heller, was a really great way of allowing someone who wants to be aware of what people are talking about and what's going on to be informed of these things. And if this is all you read, you've got a good overview. And if you want to read more, this is a great place to start. So all of that being said, I really enjoyed working through this book, learning a lot, and would commend it to anyone who wants to learn more about Hannah Arendt. Again, the book is called Hannah Arendt, A Life in Dark Times by Anne C. Heller.